Yanis Varoufakis is someone I admire, so much so that I drew his picture a few years ago, which is here. That side, there you are, over there. There we are. And he's written a very interesting piece for Unheard, I think yesterday, and I thought I'd sort of analyze it. So he starts off by making three important points, or about three important points, maybe, yeah, three important points why Europe still matters for the UK, Trump's strategic wedge, the Europe's miscalculations, what Europe should have done, and he starts by drawing a parallel with the Treaty of Nanjing. And Varoufakis likens the new US-EU trade deal to China's humiliation in 1842, not because of war, but because the EU gave away concessions under tariff pressure. And it is a deliberately provocative metaphor framing Europe as a supplicant power. The scale of the concession under the deal, US goods enter the EU tariff free. EU exports a blanket 15% tariff with a 50% on steel and aluminium. So the EU agrees to remove digital cloud taxes and pledge $1.35 trillion in investment and energy purchases from the US by 2028, promises he considers both unrealistic and unenforceable. And I'm inclined to agree. He notes that Trump treated the UK more generously, partly to deepen the post-Brexit split and make rejoining politically harder. Lower tariffs for Britain, especially on steel and aluminium, are seen as part of this wedge strategy. And he then points to the three EU miscalculations: overestimating the leverage of the EU's single market size, overestimating the importance of luxury goods and services deficits, and believing the US inflation and the US markets would force Trump to back down. What the EU should have done, and here I'm inclined to agree with him, is develop an internal investment program to offset potential US trade losses, to reopen relations with China on green and digital tech, to impose cloud taxes and reform IP law to reduce US dominance, and to reduce the reliance on US fracked gas and weaponry. The EU has failed to act like a sovereign power and has become a willing vassal in the Atlanticist empire. Varoufakis is a skilled rhetorician, but his argument rests on certain premises that deserve scrutiny. The humiliation frame, I think, is overdrawn. The 1842 analogy is emotionally effective but structurally misleading. China had no agency in 1842. The EU entered these talks willingly, voluntarily, and retains political and economic capacity. The power asymmetry is real, but the situation is not a colonial diktat. I think his prescription for 600 billion euros a year EIB-led investment programs, it assumes rapid political consensus across the 27 member states and a willingness to loosen fiscal orthodoxy, both highly unlikely given the German-Dutch constraints. So he underestimates the difficulty of his alternative plan. And the deepening EU-China cooperation may make sense economically, but globally and politically it risks a backlash from Washington and within parts of Europe, especially the eastern states, wary of Beijing's strategic intentions. I think he's quite right, though, that we should be talking and trading with China vigorously. Because if we stop trading, if we stop talking, then China potentially could become a difficult country. It's much better to have jaw, and it's much better to have trade, and and we can deepen our friendship with China, particularly given the problems with Russia and the problems with North Korea and with Iran. We don't need more problems. We need more solutions. His point about elasticity in terms of tariff resilience is valid, but US consumers have faced some inflationary pressure from tariffs, and the problem is that for now, this hasn't been politically costly enough to force Trump's hand. It's plausible that Trump used trade policy to drive an UK-EU wedge, but it's also possible his calculation was transactional. London offered terms that Washington liked, and the EU didn't. Even outside the EU, the UK's prosperity, security, and strategic influence are deeply bound to Europe, and Europe should matter to the UK, and particularly given the Ukraine angle. The EU remains Britain's largest trading partner, and regulatory divergence is costly. Partial realignment in terms of standards, customs facilitation would reduce frictions. And NATO, in terms of security, NATO is central, but EU defence industrial policy, sanctions regimes, and intelligence sharing networks have shaped European security space, and the UK's exclusion weakens its influence and weakens the EU as a whole. We should be standing together. As far as Ukraine is concerned, Varoufakis doesn't dwell, but his point is worth exploring, that a more united EU-UK position pre-2022 might have bolstered, for example, the deterrence to Putin. That is a credible argument, especially if London could stiffen EU resolve on sanctions, arms, and energy policy. That said, Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 while the UK was still within the EU, and membership alone is therefore not a deterrent. The unity of policy and scale of sanctions matter more. If the UK were inside, a larger bloc might have improved the EU's negotiating leverage with Trump, both in trade talks and in standing against punitive tariffs. The combined EU-UK market is bigger, the political symbolism is stronger. The EU needs to expand to be more powerful on the world stage. That means either embracing Turkey, in fact, that means embracing Turkey. And in fact, Turkey has just launched its own version of TikTok, which I think is called Next or something, literally a day or so ago. And it looks very vigorous, and anything that challenges Elon Musk must be a good thing. Varoufakis is TikTok? No, not TikTok. Instagram, X. Is it X? What's it? Twitter. My mind is going. Twitter. It's the Turkish version of Twitter is called Next, I think. Varoufakis is right to say the EU was caught in a negotiation it couldn't walk away from, and this has exposed structural weaknesses in Europe's strategic autonomy. He's wrong, I think, or at least overly optimistic in implying that his alternative path was politically realistic in today's EU. And for the UK, the lesson is this: the EU's negotiating power, even when flawed, still matters enormously to us. And in an era of Trumpian deal-making, Chinese assertiveness, Russian aggression, Europe is our first and most natural global multiplier. Realigned, not necessarily rejoining, could restore some of the lost weight that Brexit has sacrificed.